One of the most common questions that I get from people is what should they read? What kind of books should they read to get started? What kind of books should they read to gain some knowledge and get into apologetics? And this question is always a challenge for me to answer because I realize that people are different. Some people are convinced by some things, some people are convinced by other things. Some people process information in this way, some people process information in another way, and so on. Also, it's my belief that a really good resource is going to take into account the full human, not just the intellect, not just the emotions, but also will take into account a cultural lens that the person is going to be looking at the information through. So today I'm going to give you what I would consider probably the top 3 books that I would recommend to all Christians to read. And at the end, I'll go ahead and give a couple bonus ones as well. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Meme team, you guys ready? Then let's go! All right, so book number 1. The first book that I'm going to recommend to everybody to read is going to be called Tactics by Greg Koukl. Now, the reason that I recommend this book is because tactics actually gives you a way to kind of ask questions in social situations. So it doesn't always make you the aggressor. You're not always the person that's going to be like, here, let me tell you why Christianity is true. But instead, it allows you to ask questions. And you can also ask these questions as a way of genuinely getting to understand the person's perspective before you start giving them information that may or may not be convincing to the person. So a couple of questions that they train you to ask in the book is, what do you mean by that? So that way you're getting clear on your definitions. So you guys are talking about the same thing. And how did you come to that conclusion? So that way you can understand how people came to that conclusion. Just asking those questions in every conversation increases the quality of the discussion because it's non-threatening and you're genuinely trying to understand. So it increases that kind of social element so that way you can understand where they're coming from in their current culture perspective or the social perspective. When it comes to appealing to your more intellectual side, it teaches you how to ask the right questions and it teaches you how to think and process through those questions. So even for me personally, like me and my best friend, we talk all the time and we debate on things that way we can test out, how well we know stuff, but we're constantly asking each other, how do you know that? And what do you mean by that? And what that does is over time, I've learned to actually become a better thinker because of it, because I naturally start asking myself those questions before I take on any kind of position or belief on any particular topic. It teaches you not only how to ask the right questions, but also it teaches you how to think better yourself as well. And I think that this is a relevant book for appealing to the emotional side, because a lot of times when people have these objections, and a lot of times when us as humans, when we believe stuff, we don't believe stuff for just intellectual reasons. There's also these emotional reasons that are somewhere underneath as well. So if you're trying to talk to somebody about the existence of God and they're giving you these objections could be, not all the time, of course, but these objections could just be smoke screens and that are hiding a deeper issue, an emotional issue. So when you're asking people, how did you come to that conclusion? It could open up the door of communication so that way you can learn what their emotional objections are. And then you end up responding to the actual real objection instead of what they're just kind of saying on the surface. The second book that I recommend is called The Reason for God by Tim Keller. And this book, actually, I've read it a few times, so it's looking pretty old. But I think that this book is an excellent book. And the reason why I think it's so good is because the author of the book was a pastor in New York for some 20 years or something like that. And he would get asked the same questions over and over and over. And then the ones that he got the most, he actually put into this book and answered them from a really thoughtful, intellectual way. And at the same time, he understood the emotional aspect and the cultural backdrop that the questions were being asked out of. And he tried to answer those questions in this book in that same way as well. So the reason why, in my opinion, just my opinion, the reason why I like this book more than a lot of other apologetic books to give people is because it's answering questions that people are actually asking. Not everybody is asking about the kalam or the ontological argument and stuff like that. This takes the practical questions that people are asking and gives you a really good, relatable, and an easy kind of way to digest the questions. And then that way you can respond to them in kind. So now the next book that I recommend is called On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. Now this, I'll say right out the gate, I don't think that this one does appeal to the full human, like I said before, but nonetheless, I think the book is still vital and it's good to have. The reason why is because although the book is just purely kind of intellectual and it's not really answering questions that people have a lot of the time, it's a good offensive book to have these arguments for God's existence on hand and understand them correctly, even if for no other reason that a lot of the atheists and skeptics online will attack these arguments and they almost always misunderstand the arguments or don't understand them correctly. So that's why it's so important for Christians and believers to be able to understand the arguments correctly and be able to articulate them as well. On Guard is good because it's not so hard that it's only written for like academics and for scholars or something like that, right? The first chapter is a little tougher, by the way. So if you do get that book, then make sure that you realize that the first chapter is a lot harder, but after that, it gets a lot easier. So it's really good because it breaks down the arguments for the layman and it's actually really accessible. And now for the bonus round. So now this next book, I would recommend if you're trying to get a more of kind of a thoughtful take on the gospel. This book is called The Prodigal God by Tim Keller. Tim Keller is the same individual who wrote the second book that I recommended, The Reason for God. But this book is more focused on the gospel, and he tells it through the story of the prodigal son. And I thought that this book was actually really influential in my life because it was the first step where I started thinking differently about the gospel and started to understand it from a much more biblically faithful view. So I would recommend that book as well. And last, another book that was really influential in my thinking and actually helped shape a lot of my thinking and understanding was this was a textbook that I got in college when I took philosophy of religion. It's called Reason and Religious Belief, an introduction to the philosophy of religion. And this book was really good because it would actually go through a lot of the arguments and beliefs about God, and it would give you kind of the pros and cons. So if you're kind of looking for a way to kind of wrestle through it where you're like, okay, here's the arguments for this position and against this position, and you just want to kind of have more of kind of a neutral take on it, I would recommend that book. But also make sure you take some courses on logic or something like that as well. So that way you can kind of learn the I want to say like the backbone of a lot of the stuff that you'll find in philosophy of religion. So those are just a few of the books that I would recommend. There's a ton of books that I would recommend. I have a lot of books that I like back there and they're good for different things, but I'll eventually probably do a book tour, but for now we're just going to stick to these. All right. So if you guys did want to pick up a copy of any of those books, I left links to them down below in the description if you're interested. And that's it for now. So the next time that any of you are going to send me an email or send me a message asking me what books I recommend, I'm going to refer you to this video and then I'm going to say, what do you mean?